You mentioned on page 104 of the book, Lord of Spirits, how when Adam and Eve took the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that the church fathers say God would have ultimately given it to them, but it was fruit they were too immature for at the time and therefore would have resulted in their own self destruction. And then I know you guys talk about the book of Enoch on the podcast, and like we correlate in
Not
that.
very often, actually.
Yeah, no, not often.
People say we talk about it all the time, but we literally almost never do.
I've heard you talk about that.
We
It's
do,
just in
yeah.
the intro, so that's why people think that.
It is in the intro.
Um, but like the Book of Enoch is cool because it shows which teachings came from which fallen angel. So I just wrote down a couple like weapon making, eye makeup, alchemy, cutting of roots, astrology, knowledge of signs, the course of the moon. These things are referenced in 1 Enoch as being things that came from the teachings of fallen angels. Is it safe to say the church fathers' understanding was that God would have taught us those things eventually, but we were just too immature for it at the time? Or what would your take be on that?
Yes. Yeah. The short answer is yes. So the longer answer is that technology in general and various kinds of wisdom in general are ultimately made for man, right? But the history of humanity and the history of so much evil is about grasping something before we're ready for it. I mean, almost everything we discover, the first thing we try to figure out how to do is how to destroy people with it, right?
Yeah.
Split the atom. Let's make a bomb. You know, and it's interesting you mentioned like cosmetics. Cosmetics are given in this class and the reason why they're associated with dark wisdom and with evils, right, is that the purpose is when it's instituted is seduction, right? That's the purpose of it is seduction, which is about satisfying one's own desires and controlling other people. You know, that's what seduction is for.
Yeah.
So yeah, actually, if you look at, I know like people get excited about Enoch, but I would say if you're going to read some Second Temple Jewish literature, the one that is maybe a little bit easier to swallow and to understand is the Book of Jubilees.
Okay.
And I should just underline for maybe some of your listeners who are or viewers who are not familiar with these texts. I'll just say something very briefly about how the Orthodox Church has traditionally regarded them. We do not regard them as scripture. We do not regard them as on the same level as scripture. We regard them as books that are helpful to read at home if one understands the tradition well enough to interpret them correctly.
Okay.
Right? Not required reading by any means, you know. And so even though, like, for instance, First Enoch gives references, this fallen angel gave this piece of knowledge, like that is not the dogma of the church. Like, it's this angel did this and this.
Okay.
That is not the case, right?
That's
helpful. But the point is, it's presenting an image to help us understand what went on. Okay. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that happens in the Book of Jubilees is right after the flood. So Jubilees is basically kind of Genesis from another angle, is what Jubilees essentially is, right? So right after the flood, one of the things that happens as God is sending a whole bunch of fallen spirits into the abyss is he goes to he says to the obedient spirits, the angels, he says to them to go to Noah and teach Noah and his sons about medicines, right? And so the idea is like, well, these fallen angels kind of let the cat out of the bag and gave this dark wisdom to these other people, and that's part of why the world went so downhill, and then the flood had to come. Noah and his family are righteous, and in fact, the only people that are righteous in the world at that moment. And so I'm going to give them this knowledge so that they can use it wisely. Right. Mm-hmm. So you actually see that happening from God.
Yeah.
So ultimately, like we're called to theosis, which is to be united with God such that we become like God. And part of that, of course, means growth in wisdom and knowledge. Mm-hmm. God knows all things. He knows how all these things work, how they work well, how they work badly, right?
Yeah.
And so becoming like God is to gain the wisdom to know what our interactions with the created world ought to be, right? Okay. So that when we see a tree, we could potentially use that to make a house and not to make a club, to hit somebody with.
Yeah.
It has a
Yeah.
good use, right? Um, you know, metallurgy has lots of good uses as well. All of these things, and like this is in Genesis chapter 4, it describes the rise of technology. And though it's not explicit that this happens with the influence of evil spirits, it's happening within the context of the family of Cain. So clearly, these are sort of the bad guys, so to speak, at this point in the history of Genesis. So that rises up within an evil context, whether you want to think of it as being from evil spirits or not. Although almost every ancient person would have understood this was given through the rise of the intervention of spirits.
Mhm.
The technologies that are mentioned there are music, keeping of livestock, and metallurgy. Those are the ones that are explicitly mentioned. And of course, in the modern world, we would not look at any of these things and say, "Oh, keeping livestock, that's bad.
Yeah.
Metallurgy, that's bad. Music, that's bad." But if we understand what the context of that rising up at that moment in history would have been, then we can understand it better. Metallurgy, okay, they're making swords, right?
Mhm.
First thing they do is make weapons. Music is traditionally associated with magic and seduction and casting spells and controlling people, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Obviously, this has a good use as well too. It's used in worship of the one true God, right?
Yeah.
You might like, well, keeping livestock. What could possibly be wrong with that? Well, when you're going from nomadic hunter gatherer to keeping livestock, what you are doing is pooling wealth, and the now one person is controlling a major food source,
Mhm.
and that's used to control other people,
Yeah.
right? So in that
Definitely.
context, it is wicked.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good answer. I think one of them that I had a hard time shutting my eyes to after I became a Christian was astrology, because I was big into that when I was a new ager. I was like doing people's astrological charts, their sun, rising, moon signs, where, the different planets were. Like I was so into that. And so and I saw, like, it felt like truth for me at the time. I could
Sure.
see a lot of truth in it, and so I didn't know, like, when I was reading this, okay, is there some validity to something like astrology? But it just, I guess if you're using it in the wrong way, you can be looking to it as your God instead of to God as
Yeah.
God.
I mean, there is astrology in the scriptures, and there's good and bad astrology in the scriptures, right? So the bad astrology is basically kind of, I mean, honestly, like the astrology you see in newspapers and online and stuff is just garbage. Like
Yeah.
it's really not based on anything. But if there is something that is based historically on, it's based on augury, which is this attempt to kind of know things you should not know,
Mhm. The
right? Whether it's
future.
present realities or the future, especially people are really concerned about the future.
Or about yourself, like these, like, selfish
Yeah,
ambitions.
yeah, exactly. And it's this idea of that the sun and the moon and the stars kind of assert this influence on you, depending on when you're born, depending on what's going on in the sky right now, all this kind of stuff. And so biblical astrology, in the sense of like the astrology of ancient Israel, because Israel has astrology. Like for instance, each of the 12 sons of Jacob, each one is associated at the end of the book of Genesis with a different astrological sign in what's called the
Mm.
Testament of Jacob or the Testament of Israel. Like that's there, right? There's other astrological references in Scripture too, and these aren't pagans doing pagan things. This is Israel doing Israel things.
Mhm, mhm,
There's a sense that reading the heavens is about trying to understand what God is communicating,
mhm.
right? And the sense that, like, for instance, there's that line in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And this is an astrological thing to say, because the heavens, the sun and the moon and the stars, are closely associated with angelic beings,
Mhm.
and so the idea is that they obey God. And so, if we can understand their obedience to God and understand the way that God made the world, then we can be more obedient ourselves. That's what's going on there,
Yeah.
right? This is not about predicting the future, or it's not some kind of weird personality test or any of that stuff, right? It's simply that God speaks, and one of the ways that He speaks is that the heavens declare the glory of God.
Mm.
And of
Yeah.
course, probably the biggest sort of astrological moment, maybe in the scriptures, is when there's a star that precedes the Magi from the east to lead them to Christ.
Right. Yeah.
That's
I know.
astrological. That is the logic of the stars. That's literally astrology.
So, okay, and I know this is sort of, it can get dangerous because the world doesn't practice it in that way. The
No,
world practices it in
no.
a, like, "This is my God" kind of
Yeah,
way.
yeah.
But so, and I don't even, I'm hesitant to even ask the question because I don't wanna lead anybody astray and them being like, "Oh, so I should do astrology." But,
Ask away.
like, so if you reference it or, like, see it as true, but God is, like, your ultimate God, and you know that, like, He created all of this and ultimately His will is sovereign, is there a place for that or just steer clear?
I think that people's understanding of astrology here in 2024 is so deformed that there's no obvious way to approach this in a healthy way.
Yeah.
Except I would simply say that the heavens declare the glory of God, and to look at what it says in Scripture and to accept that,
Mhm.
mainly because there's so much baggage, but also like you don't need that for your salvation. You don't, right? You don't need to understand ancient Israelite astrological signs for your salvation.
Yeah.
Now, seeing that that's in the scripture and trying to understand what the scripture is saying, absolutely, that's perfectly good and fine and laudable, right? It's absolutely a laudable thing to do.